Welcome back. The Supreme Court has delivered judgment on appeals arising from governorship elections held in 6 states. Key among these is that on the one for Nasarawa state governorship election, where the Apex Court affirmed Abdullahi Sule of APC as the validly elected governor. Now, the Apex Court dismissed the appeal of David Ombugadu, the governorship candidate of the People's Democratic Party, for lacking merit. In the Ogun State matter, the justices of the Apex Court affirmed the election of Dapo Abiodun of APC as it dismissed the appeal of Oladipo Adetibu, candidate of the PDP, and the Supreme Court also affirmed the election of Ubasani as Kaduna State Governor, Nasser Idris as Kebbi State Governor, Inuwa Yahya as Gombe State Governor, and Sheriff Omobori as Delta State Governor. All right, Rise News analyst Dr. Sam Amadi joins us now to offer some perspective on what the Supreme Court has done today. Good to have you, Dr. Amadi, as always. Now, these gale of verdicts favoring incumbent governors, what's the implication for lower court decisions? You'd get a sense that they knew they will be vindicated.
Well, first, I think we've seen probably, but for 1 or 2 more cases, we are coming to the end of the 2023 electoral season. And it means that, first, I have to say, look, over 10 months it took for Supreme Court. These elections were held in March, and now we are in January of another year. And then the Supreme Court has to just pronounce them, some finality. That's not good. We need to look at Ghana. 14 days, elections and electoral cases are wrapped up, and in other countries, shorter time frame, so that nobody gets sworn in who is still facing litigation. I think one of the things that come out clear now, just like last week or so, is the fact that the Supreme Court has restricted all those who were occupying the seats or who are occupying the seat before the Supreme Court decision. So essentially, status quo is maintained. It's good for political stability, its continuity, but again, it raises question as to whether really all decisions meet the real justice of the case. And my sense as a legal analyst and a scholar of jurisprudence is that when the Supreme Court has to unsettle an incumbent, it calls for more. And even the assessment of significant, what the Supreme Court calls maybe substantial non-compliance. It's not formulaic. It's not based on mathematics. It's an assessment. And another assessment, part of what will go into it is a consideration of public policy, risks and assessment of risk. So if the Supreme Court was to make this decision before each of these governors are sworn in, I could bet that maybe there could be 2 or 3 variations where the Supreme Court might even say, rule for the petitioner, or where the Supreme Court might even ask for some re-election or some area. Take, for example, the issue in Nasarawa. The general perception, or PDP's case at least, is that this is a case that the war square, where the returning officer, the INEC itself, kind of mangled things, and then 3 wards couldn't have produced 50,000 votes to offset the clear lead of the PDP candidate. So, if the Supreme Court sits on this kind of matter where there's no incumbent governor, where the policy implications are not this much, it's possible the Supreme Court could ask for some rerun or some, further action. So first is that, look, this situation does not guarantee that the court will meet the real merit of each of these cases. There's some kind of policy consideration for stability. That's why you get 7/7, 5/5, 6/6. All incumbents retain their seat. Same can be said for Kaduna, where PDP pushed a strong claim of election votes, final votes being manipulated. So that's one takeaway. The other takeaway here is that maybe first we need to have a real audit of the electoral system before even thinking about electoral amendment. I mean, I've taken the view, and it shows from all these cases, that the INEC management of it was a fiasco. I mean, if you look at Kaduna, if you look at Nasarawa, if you look at Ogun State, apart from issues around qualifications, extraneous criteria or considerations of qualification, whether certificate, forgery, or that. They contest around votes and the lack of transparency of vote counting itself, with Supreme Court's position on IRF kind of invalidating the confidence we have on the IRF as a guarantor of accuracy. We probably need to have to say, how did these elections go? So that we have a sense of how do we have less contentious election. You just can't have over 20 states up for decision at the Supreme Court in an election. We should be having maybe one or two where real issues of law are involved, so that we have to rely on the votes and INEC's determination of those votes real time in a transparent, where there's no discretion. So the Supreme Court is narrating, destroying the fact that IRF should be sacrosanct because of maybe legislative gaps in the election is an issue to worry about. So we are now back to where the Supreme Court moves from what we saw in Imo, where it upsets a status quo governor, to where it simply restores everybody. And I think the electoral system and this management is not being fair to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, by nature, is a conservative court, it's a policy court, and so oftentimes a lot more strategic consideration weigh in decision-making than just what the Supreme Court could have done maybe in different situations. So the first point is that if you don't have incumbents seated, if the disruptions will be minimal, if you conclude it since a matter of days after election, you would see cases where there could be decisions that says, we run this part of election, and they get closer to electoral justice than when you allow 10 months, governors are sworn in, exercising executive power, and then you ask Supreme Court to decide that there were irregularities in vote process for voting that may then require real destruction of status quo. So I think that we need to rethink our electoral system and decide with audit and allowing the INEC to continue the way they're doing. Appointing more partisan INEC is not the way to go forward. If you look at Delta, yes, some people will say fair result because of the fact that Omagege, probably couldn't have won because of dynamics of the state. But ultimately, the real question here is, should we trust a system that gives the Supreme Court the decision to make when the odds for making one way is high? That's really an issue to worry here.
And Dr. Amadi, just as a follow-up, during the post-election cases, we saw the courts dismiss evidence of witnesses, saying issues such as deduction of votes, stuffing of ballot boxes, mutilation of sensitive electoral materials were born out of, hearsay. But Dr. Amadi, we know that these things happen. In fact, we saw some of them, on camera. Absolutely. Some of them were recorded. So how then do we tackle these issues going forward, seeing as these crimes are almost impossible to prove at the law courts? Perfect
question. I mean, look at it this way, two ways. So the first takeaway here is that when the court says court affirms, it doesn't really mean that that's actually what happened. I mean, when you destroy evidence on hearsay, take for example the presidential tribunal, where they say, he didn't bring the governor of Kogi State to testify. I mean, so this is extreme legalism that doesn't really address issue of election, what really happened. So if we knew that ballot boxes were snatched away and torn or destroyed, and because I couldn't bring the police officer who was there, then I can't prove that case. That does not go to show the justice of it. It just simply says that the electoral rules themselves are unworkable. That's why the central feature of this election, of any democratic and fair election, should be where what really happens should not be question of evidence in court. It should be question of the IRF, the Electoral Transmission Network, open. So, for example, if INEC did not shut down the IRF, if INEC did not mismanage the transmission system, the idea was that sitting in my room here, I'll be able to see the votes real time. And if I take a screenshot of those votes entering the electronic system, then INEC, the courts would not tell me that, you need to get INEC official to testify is for proper custody. That's what technology will help us do. Technology will help us not rely on an official coming to authenticate anything. And if they fail to come, then we are ruined. And so you see, for example, in the case of Kaduna or in the case of Nasarawa, maybe the real defendant here should be INEC, because they are alleging that INEC compromised the election. And so if the same INEC is not willing to supply you with real, credible, officially approved evidence, you can prove your case. So we need to first make these elections not dependent on any discretionary action by INEC, so that real-time votes are cast, we know the votes. And so the Supreme Court will not be saddled with saying, oh, is this a credible evidence? Hearsay. The Supreme Court will not be dealing with issues of law. For example, if the votes come out and INEC official exercise discretion and say, because 5 people, somebody was stabbed in this local government, I will countenance what IRF certifies as the vote. Then we can go to court. The Supreme Court will now interpret whether judicial review of that administrative discretion, not where we'll go to court to be struggling with saying, did he call the right evidence to show what we also saw? So for us, the elections, we are manipulated in many places, and the results were not credible results. And the judicial, adjudication of those processes themselves do not lend to substantial justice. They probably, in many cases, they agree with legal justice. In some cases, they don't agree with legal justice. And that's why you're going to see pockets of protest, either physical or on social media, people definitely not accepting these judgments because they do not align with the sense of what electoral justice is about. Electoral justice simply means that when the people vote, we have a way of actually, real time, knowing what they voted for. And so their votes counting is not dependent on some legal magic that lawyers are going to do, whether it's Afe Babalola or whether it's any other lawyer for that matter, or even Michael Zekeme. No, the value of those votes should be ascertained at the point of voting and confirmed. And so what we have in 2023 is an election where evidence on air, and now the Supreme Court restores everybody. So it might be the Supreme Court really applied its mind and follow the law. It might be that the Supreme Court had a policy, save the country, restore everybody, and so nobody goes to raise any issue. So my concern as both a lawyer, an analyst, and a scholar is that the democracy we are going to give birth to through this process is not one that we have the required public trust. The Vice President spoke at the Economic Forum that, look, we need public trust. We need to restore public trust. And one way of that is that we need to have elections where people vote, go home, see the result, know that that's really what they voted for, not where 36 states are uncertain and need to go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will use a narrow lens of legalism, or Supreme Court will use a policy of stability to make decisions. I think that these results tell us that we need to do first audit of INEC and operation. And it's worrisome that INEC is being reauthorized. I mean, the president has made appointments that smack of the same partisanship. We've got people who are politicians, clear presidential aides of people in power being appointed to INEC. And nobody, not even the National Assembly, nobody is asking questions around audit of what happened. And again, this is the folly of it all. Opposition parties are moving higher towards 2023 without sitting back and say, how do we really guarantee that these votes will really count? So everybody is like under some kind of spell, racing towards 2027 and leaving this compromised INEC to continue to run an election where the outcome does not depend on the accuracy of votes count. So you see allegations of 30,000 votes were manipulated, 50,000 votes were created. Look at even Abia, where PDP is complaining. Look at Enugu State, where Labour Party claimed they are almost closing to victory until somehow some votes came up from a particular local government. We're going to have these issues until we sit back and audit this procedure and aim at a simple process. And the benchmark is guarantee, certainty, that once people vote, everybody sees the result. And I think that's what IRF is supposed to do until INEC and the judiciary shut it down and reduce its legal efficacy to mere administrative convenience.
All right, Dr. Amadi, just before we go, on a final note, and very briefly, please, yes, a form of stability and, of course, audit, as you alluded to, but what's the wider implication for future elections on this verdict? And, of course, the integrity of INEC itself? Briefly, please.
quickly it's going to lead to a spiral of violence and self-help. You know, people know, look, is win the election, go to court. That's the reference. So we're going to see people focus more on the mechanics of winning election, and that's not the mechanics of responding to people's concern, not the mechanics of effective campaign, but the mechanics of wringing out these results from the process and then going to court knowing that, look, there's no magic in which a judiciary will really interpret, you know, and after 50 days or 40 days or 10 months, the status quo, the cost of offsetting, the sunk cost will be so high that the judiciary will say, carry go. It's going to further undermine the credibility of election. And the outcome of it is that the idea that democracy leads to the development is conditioned on the kind of process for election, conditioned on whether the electoral process can compel performance. That can only happen if it's a credible electoral process. So we're going to get to win, lose, lose, bad election, bad governance.
Arise News analyst Dr. Sam Amadi, thank you so much for joining us on Newsday.